Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Up to now, Labour's answers on the really big questions about our future after we leave the EU have been pretty vague and sometimes contradictory. The time for that is now past. Sir Keir Starmer, the Shadow Brexit Secretary, joins me now. Do you accept that you have been very unclear up to now about where you want to end up?
No, we've been very clear. We've said that we want a partnership that retains the benefits of the single market and the customs union. And the events of this week prove that we're right about that.
Can I explain to you why I think that you have not been clear? You've had your deputy leader, Tom Watson, has said that we could stay inside the single market, perhaps in perpetuity. John McDonnell had said that would not be respecting the views of the single market. And you yourself have said this week that you have not been sufficiently clear on the point of the single market. My
problem is I always get very technical and legal about this, and I'm not going to do that. So let me just be clear. I mean, what are the benefits of the single market and the customs union? They are no tariffs, and they are alignment of regulations and standards, and that means that for goods and services we can trade successfully in the future. That's what we want. That's what we mean by the benefits.
Okay.
And to some extent, the model doesn't matter. It's what are the outcomes.
Can I try and ventriloquise for you? What you want is you accept that you can't stay inside the single market, as Ian Blackford has just asked, because of the referendum result. But you want a new treaty which gives you as many of the benefits of the single market and the customs union as can be negotiated.
Well, the way we've put
is that true?
The way we've put it is that we would start with viable options, staying in a customs union and a single market variant, which means full participation in the single market. So it's a bit more than that. We want the full benefits, and we're clear about what the starting options would be.
Right.
But the developments this week show that we're right in our approach, because one of the reasons we've advocated that course is because it's the only way to achieve no hard border in Northern Ireland. It's a point I put to David Davis in the House of Commons on Tuesday. You can't sweep the customs union and the single market off the table on the one hand, and also say you don't want a hard border in Northern Ireland, and that is exactly the conclusion, really, of the negotiations this week.
OK, well, let's talk a little bit about... I want to come on to your position in a second.
Yeah.
But this hard border question, we have this new word, full convergence.
Yes.
Of regulations between the EU on the one hand and the entire UK on the other.
Yes.
But we're told this morning that that's not legally meaningful, and that actually it may not mean much in the end.
Well, the document that was released on Friday commits to no hard border, meaning no infrastructure and no related checks or controls. That's an absolutely clear commitment. There's an equally commitment. Just let me finish this, if you don't mind.
It's a fallback position.
I'll come to that. There's a commitment to the North-South cooperation, which is across a whole range of areas. And what's written into the document is that these are commitments, come what may, in all circumstances, whether agreements are reached or not.
But the document also says no customs union and no single
market.
Well,
and you push me on, that's the fallback position, so let me deal with that. I am, having read and reread the small print here, including the EU Commission's own assessment, I am clear that the fallback in the first position, in fact, will collapse into one, which is alignment. And I'll tell you why I say that. I've been saying over and over again...
So you think this is the real deal?
This is the real deal. You can't have no hard border if you don't have alignment.
And you're saying that because the European Commission is also saying it?
The European Commission on Friday issued their own document, which is their own assessment of the agreement that was released on Friday. Now, remember, they are on the other side of the negotiating table, and they say they did a mapping exercise of the North-South cooperation agreements, and they were clear that the biggest single risk is divergence to those North-South agreements because they're based on EU law and policy. And then they went on to say what the UK have said is that their aim is to solve this with a EU-UK agreement, the number one option that David Davis will talk about in just a minute. And then this is what the EU say about this. This intention seemed hard to reconcile with the United Kingdom's communicated decision to leave the internal market and the customs union. So 9 months in...
But with respect, they would say that, wouldn't
Well, they're on the other side of the table,
yeah.
And they're saying we do not see how, option 1 isn't essentially the same as option 3. These will collapse into it. And that is why you're seeing the reaction that you're seeing this morning from those on the right of the Tory party, because they realise that this collapses into one way forward, which is alignment and convergence.
Okay. So for a lot of people this is confusing, but let me be very clear. You really think that the agreement that Theresa May struck this week means that Britain will in perpetuity stay very, very close to the single market and the customs union?
Yes. And I think that's the right thing, and I think we should hold her to that, because that goes to the heart of the question, what sort of Britain do we want to be? Do we see Europe as our major trading partner in the future, or do we want to rip ourselves apart from that?
That's exactly where I want to get to, and your own position. So you want a new treaty giving us the full access and benefits to the single market and the customs union.
Yeah, it'll have to be a new treaty.
And you have said it's a bit like a Norway-style treaty for the 21st century.
Yes.
Exactly. Now, the two things that the EU has made it absolutely clear that involves is, one, you have to carry on paying some money in. Would you accept that?
Norway pays money in. They do it actually on a voluntary basis, not to the budget. But there may be...
Would you accept it?
There may have to be payments that have to be negotiated.
So you could negotiate payments in that thing. But the other thing, as you know, is the four freedoms.
The four freedoms.
Now, you have said again and again that freedom of movement is off the table. What is after we leave, we've left, and all the rest of it. Can I ask you a different question, a subtly different question? Would maximal cross-channel migration in both directions be part of that negotiation or not?
Well, I mean, whatever the rules are will have to be negotiated. You're absolutely right to push me on this, because I've said freedom of movement can't stay the same. The status quo is not an option. That means it's got to be negotiated, and you and others push back against me and say you can't have the benefits of the single market and the customs union if you don't also accept freedom. Well, now, as a result of Friday, we've got the EU and the UK agreeing to an approach which says we must retain alignment if we're to solve the position in Northern Ireland. In other words...
So that means people moving across those borders in both directions?
Just let me make this point, because, you know, what's said against me every time I put this argument up is you can't have that. It's fantasy, and therefore, you know, you've got to give up on the benefits of the single market and the customs union. What's clear from Friday is that the benefits of the single market and customs union are integral to Northern Ireland. And what's really important is that...
I just want to say one more time on this question of migration, people moving back and forward between the EU and the UK. It's not a kind of abstruse matter. It's about real people watching this programme. Would Labour, in that treaty, negotiate a system whereby people living in the EU could come and work here freely and vice versa? Yes or no?
That would have to be negotiated, but the end of free movement doesn't mean no movement. Of course we would want people to come from the EU to work here. We'd want people who are here to go and work in the EU. The basis of that would have to be negotiated. But
all right, easy movement if not free.
Yes, of course.
Right, OK, that's really interesting. And when it comes to the regulations, can I be absolutely clear that after we have left the EU, under your negotiation, we would still be mapping, copying and pasting, whatever, sticking very close to EU regulations when it comes to, you know, carrots, car engines, vacuum cleaners, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I mean, what underpins access and the benefits of the single market and customs union is a level playing field, that everybody applies the same regulations and standards. So if you want those benefits, you've got to stay on the same level playing field. Now, the Labour Party doesn't have a problem with that. We do not want to deregulate. We don't want to cut away
the answer to my
workplace
question is
rights,
basically
environmental rights. Yes, we are very comfortable with staying on a level playing field.
In the future, we don't have a vote on these things, but they change the vacuum cleaner regulations in a few years' time, and we change with them, even though we don't have a vote. Yes?
Yes,
okay,
just let me explain. If you're making vacuum cleaners in this country and you're selling to Europe, you are going to have to change with those, because otherwise you can't sell into that market. We've got a choice when we leave about whether we stay aligned or not. It doesn't mean we've got to exercise that choice in a way that makes it more difficult for us to change. We've got a choice and we can choose to stay aligned.
Let's rehearse where we've got to. After your negotiation with the EU, we carry on paying money in. We have very easy movement of people back and forward. So those people who voted to take our money back, those people who voted to cut immigration will not be happy. And we are going to copy and paste and follow the EU regulations, even though we don't have a vote. That is, by any standards, the worst of all worlds. You have backed yourself into a very unpleasant corner.
Well, I really don't see how it's the worst of all worlds to be able to continue to trade successfully in Europe. I really don't see how it's the worst of all worlds to have a solution that works in Ireland. 3,600 people or so were killed, murdered, over 30 years in Northern Ireland. There's a very good book published earlier this year. Which
we're going wildly off subject here.
Remember these dead. I mean, these are serious choices about the future of
course
Britain.
they are.
And having no hard border and being able to trade successfully with Europe in the future is a choice that we're entitled to make. We've got a choice.
We're going to take their regulations without a vote. We're going to carry on with a big migration back and forward, and we're going to pay money for the privilege. That has been described as being a vassal state of the EU.
How we negotiate that agreement with the EU is a matter still for negotiation. It doesn't mean it's cut and paste, but we do have a choice. Do we want to stay aligned so we can trade successfully, or do we want to tear apart? And I say we should stay aligned. We're talking about what sort of Britain we're going to be and what the next 40 or 50 years might look like. And I don't think anybody voted to make it harder to trade with Europe.
But nonetheless, you're in a position which your own colleague Barry Gardiner has described as being a vassal state, and that is going to be Labour's offer to the voters at the next election.
I think the position
Vote Labour for a vassal state.
I think the position that Barry Gardiner laid out was one at the beginning of last summer. We then
but it's where you've ended up.
We did a huge amount of work over the summer, as you know, developing our policy. We came out very clearly saying transitional arrangements are going to be needed and on the same terms as now. And that we should have as viable options on the table, staying in a customs union and a variant of the single market. And every Labour spokesperson since then has said the same thing. So I appreciate that, you know, if you go back, you can find minor differences. But really, since the summer, there's been a unified voice from Labour.
I am not, unfortunately, a mind reader. I can't do that. But I suspect that you would actually like to stay in the single market and the customs union, and you know that would be the best available option to us right now, because we would then have votes and so forth. Now, can I just ask you, would it not be more honest, would it not be more straightforward, and would it not kind of vivify and enthuse many of your own supporters if you were just able to say, do you know what, yes, let's get rid of all the obfuscation, let's get rid of all the kind of weasel words, I'd like to stay inside the single market and the customs union?
Well, Andrew, I've said we want the benefits of both, and I've said that the viable options there are staying in a customs union or a variant of the single market. And I say variant, I don't want to get technical because it doesn't help me when I do.
It's not exactly the same thing.
But everybody knows that you would have to sign a new agreement. You can't stay in exactly the same agreement you're in. You'd need a new agreement. There's got to be a variant of what we've got. But do we want full participation in the single market? Yes, we do. Do we want the benefits of the customs union? Yes, we do. Do we need to negotiate
big
to get
choices
to that?
ahead?
Yes, we do. Because that's the Britain that we want to live in.
Very big choices ahead. Jeremy Corbyn has said that the idea of a second referendum is still on the table. Is it?
Well, at the moment, I think it's absolutely clear that we've got to get through this phase of the negotiation. We've got to get through the Article 50 agreement. Now, we've never called for a second referendum. We are focusing on what the new agreement needs to look like. Your leader has said
that you haven't taken a decision on it, which means that you might call for a second referendum, yes or no?
Well, we haven't called for a second referendum.
I'm asking about the future, though.
Well, we haven't called for a second referendum. Things are moving so fast, it's hard to know what's going to come next, but we are not calling for it.
They certainly have. Sir Keir Starmer, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. The main event, in his first interview since the Brussels deal, the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, joins me. Welcome. Now, before we get going on this week's events, I have to ask you, there's no easy way of talking about this. There is an issue about your own integrity when it came to some of the things that you have said about impact assessments. You told me that you were doing lots and lots of impact assessments, sectoral impact assessments, really, really important to work out what's going to happen after Brexit. And then you told the House of Commons something else. I'm going to play you two clips. The good news, they're both you. The first is earlier in the year.
We continue to analyse the impact of our exit across the breadth of the UK economy, covering more than 50 sectors, I think 58 at the last count, to shape our negotiating position.
Has the government undertaken any impact assessments on the implications of leaving the EU for different sectors of the
Not in sectors. There's no sort of systematic impact assessment.
So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector?
On the
automotive sector?
No, not I'm aware of, no.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of,
no. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them.
No to all of them.
Right.
So did these impact assessments exist or not?
No, using the word impact doesn't make an impact assessment. Let me be clear.
But you used the word impact.
Yes, I use the word impact. Let me be clear. The impact assessment's got a proper meaning in almost in the law, certainly in civil service, and the Better Regulation Task Force has got a guideline on it. What we have done is analysed each sector and said, OK, how big is it? What employment? What how much it depend on European Union regulation, how much it depend on European Union market. That's what we've been focusing on. Not trying to...
Wait
a minute. Well, in that case, there are 850 pages of that.
So you were wrong in the House of Commons. They do exist.
No. There's a distinction, because what the people who are asking for this were sort of aiming at was the idea of a sort of forecast of the impact. You know, the forecast of how much would this industry lose under this scenario or that scenario. Those don't exist.
But that's the kind of thing that people out there would hope the government had done. I mean, you're going into this really important negotiation. People want to know what the government's view of the effect on the car industry or the aircraft industry or whatever might be.
Well, we know what the effective regulatory barriers are. That's the important thing. Do we have to deal with that? We're going to come, no doubt, later to the arguments of convergence and so on. And how do we deal with that? And what do we need to negotiate? Now, when we started this out, we were looking possibly at doing a sector-by-sector negotiation. We're not going to do that, in fact. So there's no point in doing one forecast here, one forecast there. We don't do that. And those forecasts, and those forecasts don't work. I mean, if you look at what people have forecast for the outcome of the Brexit referendum, the Treasury, the Bank of England, all said the market would go down. All said the economy would go down. Okay. What's happened? What's happened? It's actually improved. We've got the best employment we've had in this country ever. Lowest unemployment in my lifetime.
We're going way off topic. Do you not accept that you gave the impression that these detailed impact assessments were being done, had been done? They were eye-wateringly detailed. They were meticulous. They existed. As a
sectoral analysis is not the same as an impact assessment.
Okay. Here you are talking to the House of Lords Committee just in October. We are conducting a broad range of analysis on the macroeconomic and sectoral level to, quote, understand the impact of leaving the EU on all aspects of the UK, including the agriculture. That is an impact sectoral assessment of the kind you then said didn't exist.
If that's what you're describing, that's what they've got. But what they've got is 850 pages of sectoral analysis, right? That is the size, the employment, the dependence on Europe, the availability of other markets. Now, that's the data. That's there. That's done. Nobody's ever said anything different. And throughout the course of the last 18 months, sectoral analysis is the phrase I've used. What we're getting into is almost an Alice in Wonderland. Actually, no. More Gulliver. Gulliver's Travels.
Do you not think you were loose in your language, at least?
I've answered questions on this probably over 1,000 times. And I've used sectoral analysis 999 times out of 1,000.
OK, let's turn to another big issue, which is money. How much is it going to cost us, very roughly, to leave the EU?
Well, Treasury's estimate is something like 35, 39 billion, but it's very complex. There are lots of plays in it, you know.
I gave you that figure not that long ago, and you rolled your eyes and you shook your head and you laughed and you said, no, absolutely not. That's just a guess. But if 40 billion was a guess, it was a bloody good guess.
If you want to be precise about what I said, and you want precision, I said that sounds sort of made up.
Sort of made up, but it was pretty accurate, wasn't it?
And the reason it was sort of made up was because we were at that stage going through the line-by-line analysis. Nobody at that point knew what the outcome would be. We were going through line by line. And you said it earlier.
When did you know?
Oh, well, I mean, actually about a week or so ago. I mean, it was quite recently, because we didn't complete the line-by-line analysis until we went into the final round of negotiation.
It's an awful lot of money. Can you point to one occasion on which a government minister ever warned the British public that this is what it was going to cost to leave the EU?
Well, I think what you can say is from the beginning, in the Lancaster House speech, and indeed, actually, I think maybe even in her conference speech, but certainly the Lancaster House speech, the Prime Minister said, we will meet our international obligations.
But no one knew what that meant.
Well, because we hadn't calculated the numbers. We hadn't seen their bid. I mean, the opening bid was 100 billion plus. You know, we saw it on the front page of the Financial Times. Sources in Brussels say 100 billion. It's nothing like 100 billion.
But it's a lot more than nothing either.
Yeah, of course it's not nothing. I mean, you just had... wait a minute, you've just had Keir Starmer on here promising, effectively, that a Labour government will continue paying large sums of money. We're not going to do that. That's the promise we did make.
Can I just ask you about the money, the sums, because people get very confused. So 40 billion is roughly 4 years of net inputs at the moment. So for 4 years, we've got 4 years of payments.
It won't quite work like that.
It won't quite work like that. No. But at what point in this Parliament do we start to get money back? Or do you think it won't happen in a serious way, this Parliament? Hardly any will come back this Parliament.
What will happen the way it'll play is the first, if we have a 2-year transition period, which is the next piece of negotiation, that'll probably carry on pretty much as now. So you might guess 20 billion, but it is a guess. We don't know
during
because,
those 2 years,
because 2 years. Then we'll be out, and then the rest will be probably in a long tail. But we haven't actually done the profile yet of that. You know, but it'll be a long term. Maybe go on for many, many years, but quite small sums.
Okay, let's move on to this year's, this week's negotiation. It feels like a year. Feels like a year. But this week's negotiation. Now, the crucial question is whether that full convergence quote in paragraph 49,
well, it's not full convergence.
Full alignment, beg your pardon, in paragraph 49 about the Irish border.
With respect, Andrew, it's very important. That's a very important distinction.
But,
right?
okay, I've made
no, it's a very important distinction. You were berating me earlier about using words.
Okay.
The very important.
I've corrected myself. Full alignment. Though,
full alignment, and it was changed from no divergence. That's the point. And the difference is, I mean,
what does full alignment mean?
Let me just explain. No divergence would have meant actually taking cut and paste rules, right? Full alignment means, I mean, it covers about a number of areas, about 4 important ones: agriculture, road and
health,
rail,
tourism,
water.
transport.
Well, it's unlikely to have much impact on health or indeed on education, which are 2 of the sectors in there. But the ones it does have impact on, we're not looking to create a circumstance where animal welfare is worse in Britain than elsewhere. We're not looking to create a circumstance where safety of food is worse, or indeed pollutions of waterways. So we will meet the outcomes. We'll meet the outcomes, but not do it by just copying or doing what the European Union does.
Put it in simple terms.
And to put it plainly to you, because Keir sort of was reading out the Union comments on it, when that same point was put to Michel Barnier on Friday, he said, no, you don't understand. This does not mean membership of the single market or indeed membership of the customs union.
I don't think it does mean membership of either of those things. But if I put it in very, very simple terms, if they have a rule on carrots, then in due course our rules on carrots will be aligned to their rules on carrots. Their carrots and our carrots will be, broadly speaking, the same carrots.
Not necessarily. I mean, we're full alignment.
Really?
Full alignment means outcomes. It means, I mean, let's...
If I align 2 cars, they're next to each other.
Yeah. Well, Northern Ireland is next to the Republic of Ireland.
And it will have next to regulations. It'll be very similar.
There will be some similarities. I mean, again, the Prime Minister laid this out in her Florence speech. She said there are areas where we will want similar outcomes, and we'll have similar methods to achieve them. There'll be areas where we have similar outcomes, we'll have different methods to achieve them. That's going to be true of a lot of product areas, a lot of manufacturing and so on. And there'll be areas where we want different outcomes and use different methods.
Well, let's stick with what we know, which is in this agreement that you've all signed and signed up to, full alignment, does involve agriculture. David Jones, who was your junior minister, is very, very worried about this because he points out quite rightly that if we're going to do a big free trade deal with America, for instance, they really want agriculture to be part of that. They've insisted that we have to have agricultural regulations and norms that apply to them as well. And we can't be in both. We can't be both inside the EU.
You say that. We haven't yet started that negotiation, so it's a bit hard. I mean, there's an awful lot here. I mean, we see it actually in some of your earlier comments as well, both to 2 of your interviewees, of sort of assuming that what the other side says in the negotiation at the beginning is the outcome. It isn't necessarily so. And you can see an example of that this week in the Japan agreement, where there are agricultural dimensions to it. And there's no way that Europe and Japan are going to be on the same agricultural basis.
All right, but nonetheless, the US Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, a very important man in the Trump administration, has said that any deal with Brussels to maintain its regulations might hinder development of a closer post-Brexit UK-US relationship. And it was essential that we remove any unnecessary regulatory divergences with the US. Now, that seems to go against the spirit of what you have agreed looking at Dublin this week.
Well, he said maintain their regulations. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to bring back control. That's the phrase used. And the House of Commons will decide.
But you're going to be aligned. You're going to be aligned. Fully aligned, in fact.
If you look at any free trade deal anywhere in the world, and the easiest one to look at is the Canadian one with Europe. If you look at any free trade deal, what you see is agreements on where product standards normally comply. That's what it comes down to. Sometimes you see other things. In the free trade deal between Europe and Canada, they say on labour standards, they will not go below the ILO, the International Labour Organization minimum. So those are always a part of that. And what the House of Commons and what the House of Lords, what Parliament will decide in the future is what's actually good for this industry, but what's good both in terms of the market in Europe, the market in the rest of the world. They'll make those decisions independently with full sovereignty and in the light of what the consequences will be.
We have promised full alignment on a whole range of things because of the Irish border issue.
Yeah.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer has said that under virtually all circumstances...
But it's a small range of things, it's not a whole range of things.
Well, it's quite a big range of things.
Yeah.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer said that under all circumstances, we will pay the money to the EU. Can I ask you whether this agreement this week is actually real?
No, it is conditional on an outcome. No, I'm afraid that wasn't quite right. I mean, it is conditional. It's conditional on getting an implementation period and conditional on a trade outcome.
Let me put this very bluntly.
Before I finish that, now I left something out there. I said the trade outcome, but also the other elements of the treaty will strike with them, which will be security, foreign affairs, counter-terrorism.
Things. Okay. Yeah. So in the unhappy possibility, but it's a possibility that we get onto the trade side of the negotiations, phase 2, and the EU really take us to pieces on that. They don't give us what we want. They're not at all helpful when it comes to the city or commerce generally, and they really have us over a barrel, and we hate it. And we say we're not having any of that. In those circumstances, are we committed to the regulatory convergence? Are we committed to paying the money?
Well, no deal is no deal. Now, wait a minute, let me finish. You want the answer.
Okay.
Otherwise, you'll be coming back to me later saying, you only said this, didn't say the second half. So, number one, no deal means that we won't be paying the money. Some of these areas...
Okay, the Chancellor is wrong about that.
Yeah, it's been made clear by number 10 already, so that's not actually new. The second element about this is the other areas. Now, look, one of the things we have had as a major objective, a major negotiating objective for the British government, and we don't normally lay our red lines out in public, that's one of the things I've always said, is we want to protect the peace process, and we also want to protect Ireland from the impact of Brexit for them. So we were, this was a statement of intent more than anything else. It was much more a statement of intent than it was a legally enforceable thing.
Here is the crucial question. That promise on full alignment that we have made not just to the EU, but also in specific terms to the Irish government, to Dublin. If we don't get a deal, does that promise get torn up?
Well, I think if we don't get a deal, we're going to have to find a way of making sure we keep the open, keep the frictionless border, as it were, an invisible border in Northern Ireland. We do it at the moment. Understand something. At the moment, there are different tax and levy regimes and excise regimes north and south of the border. We manage that without having border posts allotted along the 300 rows there. And we'll find a way of doing that too.
The Taoiseach thinks that he has got that full alignment in his back pocket. That is an absolutely firm promise from Theresa May and yourself and the British government. He may be watching this. Can you look in the camera and say that we absolutely commit ourselves to that?
What we say is we commit ourselves to maintaining a frictionless, invisible border. That's what we undertake.
Even with no deal?
Even with no deal, even with a WTO deal, we'll find.
How? Because, that is a border between the EU and us.
I strongly recommend reading our paper that we published. We published 14 papers this year, this summer.
Just tell people, is it a technical solution?
Well, there'll be technical solutions. There'll be solutions using things like trusted traders, so big companies would actually cross the border without any check, but they'd notify and there'd be audits of them. There'll be issues like electronic pre-notification. There'll be all sorts of things. And also large allowances for small companies. There are a whole series of possibilities that we can do, which nobody's engaged on yet. We need to engage for the next stage to get that right.
Transitional period, about 2 years.
About 2 years, yeah.
Is it going to be the case that during that transitional period we are still negotiating or not?
No, we would expect, well, there might be some minor negotiation going on, but we'd expect a substantive trade deal to be struck. Not signed, because we've got to be technically outside immediately afterwards. But
there could be tinkering going on.
Right. There'll be maybe tinkering, but the substantive deal must be struck.
So in real terms, we now, because there has to be an implementation phase and all that, we have about 8 months to do an incredibly complicated trade deal that took Canada 7 years. Are you really convinced it can all be done in 8 months?
It's not that complicated. It comes right back to the alignment point. The first thing is we want an overarching free trade deal, which has no tariffs. All right, so you don't have to negotiate every tariff line, which takes a long time. Secondly, we start in full alignment. We start in complete convergence.
So it can be done in,
and so we then work it out from there.
Let me push back one more time on this, because this comes to the kind of arrangement we want to have once we have finally left the EU, which the Cabinet is finally going to discuss before Christmas. Can I ask you what your vision of that is?
Well, I mean, it's not just my vision. It's what actually has been discussed in Cabinet already, before the Lancaster House speech, before the Florence speech, before the White Paper that was published, which is an overarching free trade deal, but including services, which Canada doesn't, with individual specific arrangements for aviation, for nuclear, for data, a whole series of strands which we've worked out too. Most of them based on where we start now. And then the thing, as Michel Barnier himself has said, the thing is how we manage divergence. That's the point. How we manage divergence so it doesn't undercut the access to the market.
Going further forward.
And we can do that, but Parliament will control that.
If the basic deal, I'm being very crude about this, but is Canada plus the city or something like
Canada
that?
plus as well, probably would be
now
one way of putting it. But
the pluses are difficult, aren't they? Because, for instance, the French want to steal as much of the city as they possibly can. So the fact that they can...
I wouldn't use that word. That's your word.
That's my word. It's possible, appropriate, grab, whatever, as much of the city as they possibly can. Now, it's perfectly possible that that will make a very difficult negotiation and that cannot be done within 8 months. So if it's not finished within 8 months, what happens?
I don't agree. I mean, it's more like a year than 8 months in truth. Because bear in mind, we can't sign this until after March, until after we actually leave. Maybe 1 minute after we leave, or 1 second after we leave, but the formal technicalities, we can't do that. But we've got about a year, and that was actually why this week was important. That's because if we got... No, let me finish the point. If we had gone through this week...
I've got another this week question.
All right, then, and come back into March, then we really would have been compressed, and I would then be sitting here agreeing with you saying it's difficult to do. So the odds, as it were, against a WTO or no-deal outcome have dropped dramatically.
That's the meaning of this week.
That's right.
Let me ask you what Michael Gove meant when he said that this can all be looked at again at the next general election. If we don't like the deal that David Davis has struck, don't worry, we can go to the voters and strike. That wasn't very helpful, was it?
Well, it's a sort of statement of the obvious that any new government is elected on a mandate of its own. Now, we would be re-elected, I would hope, on the mandate of the deal we've delivered. Any other government might not be, and that's a function of democracy. Of course, that would mean there'll be consequences. You'd have to go back and renegotiate something, whatever. But it's a statement of the obvious. It's a statement of the fact that in Britain, Parliament is sovereign, or at least it will be once we get back to the situation we're negotiating.
And what you want is Canada plus.
You're desperately trying to get a headline out of this. What we want is a bespoke outcome. We'll probably start with the best of Canada and the best of Japan and the best of South Korea, and then add to that the bits that's missing, which is the services.
OK. Right. Thank you very much indeed.
The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, says Britain won't pay the divorce bill for leaving the European Union if there's no final trade deal with the EU. Today, he's been giving details of the kind of future arrangement he'd like to see. Meanwhile, the Labour Party has suggested it may be willing to pay for access to the European single market in order to retain its benefits. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
The strain was beginning to show. This was the Prime Minister on her early morning dash to Brussels on Friday. It was meant to be the easy bit, but getting the EU to talk trade proved tricky, and serious challenges lie ahead. The EU has called for more clarity about what kind of relationship Britain wants in future. Today, the Brexit Secretary tried to give it.
Canada plus as well, probably would be one way of putting it.
So what on earth does that mean? Well, Canada has negotiated a wide-ranging trade deal over 7 years, but it doesn't include financial services. A Canada Plus deal would cover this vital industry for the UK. What else could we expect?
If you look at any free trade deal, what you see is agreements on where product standards normally comply. That's what it comes down to. Sometimes you see other things. In the free trade deal between Europe and Canada, they say on labour standards, they will not go below the ILO, the International Labour Organization minimum.
But he made clear that paying a divorce bill to the EU would be dependent on getting a good deal. I don't expect to see an awful lot of seasonal goodwill when ministers finally discuss what kind of deal they want to do with the EU just before Christmas. Already, for example, the Brexit Secretary and the Chancellor seem to disagree over whether we should pay a divorce bill under all circumstances. But one thing has become clearer today: what Labour would do if Jeremy Corbyn moved in here to number 10. The shadow Brexit Secretary suggested it would be economically damaging if Britain moved too far away from EU rules and regulations.
What sort of Britain do we want to be? Do we see Europe as our major trading partner in the future, or do we want to rip ourselves apart from that?
And he suggested, like Norway, Labour wanted to stay close to the EU and maybe prepared to pay for access to its single market.
Norway pays money in. They do it actually on a voluntary basis, not to the budget. But there may be...
Would you accept it?
There may have to be payments that have to be negotiated.
And the Shadow Foreign Secretary would consider staying close to the EU's customs union too, which might restrict the ability to do trade deals.
We have always been pragmatic and realistic. Most of our trade is with the European Union. We're just stating a fact. And so we should not be kiboshing that.
The political parties have contained some of the disagreements in Europe by being a bit ambiguous about the future. But with trade talks about to start, difficult decisions can no longer be deferred. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Now, the Brexit Secretary David Davis has claimed the odds of Britain leaving the EU without a trade deal have dropped dramatically, although he insisted that the UK wouldn't pay any divorce bill to Brussels without what he called a trade outcome. He described the kind of agreement he wanted to reach as a supercharged version of Canada's deal with the EU, which took a mammoth 7 years to complete. Here's our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy.
For weeks, the Brexit talks with the EU have felt a lot like skating on thin ice. Like the people here at Winterville in South London, it's been heads down, slip-sliding tentatively forward, sometimes even backwards. But with the so-called Phase 1 talks finally over, the government supposedly got the UK on much firmer footing.
In the seemingly never-ending circular arguments that have characterised the Brexit negotiations so far, Friday's agreement was heralded as a major breakthrough, the key to unlocking the next critical phase of negotiations. Yet today, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, held out the prospect that Friday's agreement may not hold, that Britain may not pay its divorce bill unless it gets its way on a raft of other key issues like the transition agreement and trade.
When David Davis was asked if Britain will pay its divorce bill to the EU under all circumstances, as the Chancellor Philip Hammond has stated, he had this to say.
No, it is conditional on an outcome. No, I'm afraid that wasn't quite right. I mean, it is conditional. It's conditional on getting an implementation period and conditional on a trade outcome.
So the money is conditional on a trade outcome. David Davis seems to want to have his cake and eat it, but can he? The UK has agreed to pay around £40 billion to the European Union, but that's part of the divorce settlement for our departure in March 2019. Yet Mr Davis appeared to link the payment to the much more ambitious trade agreement, but it's clear that can't be signed until after the UK has left. So sweeping between the bill and the trade deal when it suits is not something the EU would ever legally accept. Labour's Keir Starmer was clear we have to stick to the agreement as billed.
I think it's a very important deal. I think it's very important that everybody holds the agreement and nobody tries to distance themselves and walk away from it.
Mr Davis also gave some first clues as to the type of pick-and-mix trade deal he wants to see.
What we want is a bespoke outcome. We'll probably start with the best of Canada and the best of Japan and the best of South Korea, and then add to that the bits that's missing, which is the services.
But that may be met with a frosty reception, especially since the Cabinet isn't due to agree a position on trade till later this month, never mind what the EU itself has in store.